Hello, everyone. It's 4 p.m. in the UK, so it's time for us to get started on our 10-week course, virtual PhD course on environmental economics in low and middle income countries. This is hosted by BRED and the IGC. I'm Kelsey Jack, and together with Robin Burgess, we've put together what we think is a very exciting 10 weeks to give you an introduction to this emerging and exciting area of research. I hope that you're as excited as we are to be able to participate in this. So today is the first lecture. What we're going to do is try to get you excited about the topic, try to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the types of things that you should be able to expect to learn about over the coming weeks. I'm going to pass this over to Robin in just a moment, but before I do, I want to give a huge thanks to Caleb and Allegra, who are here with us today, who have done a lot of the work to make this all possible. Just to let you know who I am briefly, I'm on the faculty at UC Santa Barbara. I work on environment and development economics, and so I'm particularly excited to see this course come together. So you'll hear from me in the second half. Let me pass this now to Robin to kick us off.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Robin Burgess. I'm sitting in a very sunny London day, and we're in the middle of LSE Environment Week. So I just wanted to kind of say a couple of things about the course before I actually begin the lecture. I think the big thing about this course is it's going to bring people from kind of all types of economics to focus on a bunch of issues around environmental and energy. And I don't think we need to kind of say up front why that's so important. That'll become very apparent even in the first lecture. But I think what's happened in this field is that economists of all types have now become interested in these issues, and they're crowding into the field. So when Kelsey and I were trying to put together the course, we thought we'd like to reflect that in the set of lectures and the course content. So you'll be looking at environment and energy from a whole bunch of different perspectives, which I think is kind of where this field is headed. Let me just start off now with what Kelsey and I are going to do in the first hour is basically kind of introduce some of the topics, talk a little bit about our own interests, but mainly, as she said, to try to get you excited about this set of issues. And I think when I was thinking about this, what I kind of came up with, I guess, is that
Robin, sorry, can I interrupt you for just a second? In the interest of getting everyone excited about this, I think it was posted, but just to say it out loud, if you're interested in having your video projected but remaining muted so that you can be a little bit more interactive, participate as a panelist, please put up your hand. And it looks like there are a bunch of hands already, but if you miss reading this in the chat, I just want to say it out loud. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. So I think if I just go back one slide, I think when I was thinking about this, here we go. There's sort of these two big areas, since this is sort of energy and environment applied to developing countries or lower middle income countries. There was sort of two big things in the world. The first was, the thing that has coalesced this field, which is the elimination of extreme poverty. And now we have this sort of new challenge, which is, it's not just climate change, it's environmental change, and it has many different facets. But what I wanted to do is to sort of focus today on three areas where I see there's a lot of innovation, and Kelsey will sort of build on this, which is in these three areas here on climate adaptation, natural capital, and clean energy. And those by no means there's going to be much more stuff covered in the course, but I thought it'd be worthwhile sort of focusing a little bit on innovation, because I think in order to kind of achieve a balance between growth, which is sort of a key thing for reducing poverty, and the externalities from growth, we're going to have a lot of innovation. And I wanted to kind of think about three areas where I think a lot of work is happening, and there's a lot of policy interest as well. So why, the kind of fundamental question you may be asking yourself, why do I want to do this course? And I think the three biggest things that I could come up with is firstly, and it's sort of energy and environment applied to developing countries. The first and most obvious is that this is where the extreme poor are located primarily. And so they're also the group that's been most affected by environmental change. And that sort of builds up the case for focusing on this area because that's where the damages are being most acutely felt, right? So there's a natural tendency to focus on these types of countries. But the other thing, which is perhaps less obvious, is that this is also the area where energy consumption and hence emissions are also rising most quickly. So it's no longer the case that we could just think about, adaptation in developing countries and mitigation in developed countries. The bulk of the future growth in energy consumption emissions will take place in developing countries. And hence, we're going to have to focus both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side. So this is sort of kind of queuing up the kind of overlap. So at the top, we have this graph from a paper by Tam and Carlton and others recently published in the QJE, showing the sort of mortality above 65 mortality effects. And one thing you can notice there is that the blue means that the mortality is decreased, but the red is mortality is increased. And I guess the key thing is on the bottom, you see the kind of map of extreme poverty and the overlap between where the mortality is going to be increased by temperature increases and where the poor are there's a very strong overlap, particularly in Africa and South Asia. So this is sort of the beginning of why do we focus on these types of countries, which is pretty apparent from this map. The second thing is, of course, the question about what is actually happening, and I guess this is the furthest back you can go, and you can really start to see that actually, it really is happening. It's very difficult to look at this graph and say, well, no, there's not been an extraordinary increase in temperature. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to kind of throw out there, because I think it's important, is I wouldn't be sort of thinking about environmental and energy just in terms of climate change. There's a whole set of issues, many around water, many around biodiversity loss, sea level rise, and we'll be hearing about all of these things. And I think it's really, really important to say that how multifaceted these changes are. So the first point is that the inequality of damages is enormous. So there's a kind of a need to then think about global redistribution to some extent in order to address those issues, but also to think about, well, whatever kind of area you're in, there's so many different challenges that need to be confronted. And so I think we need to think about rather different types of policy, rather different parts of government, rather different types of NGOs, and the private sector to address all these challenges. And then this is just showing that the kind of, I guess you could call it the growth in interest, at least the growth in policy interest from moving from the Millennium Development Goals, which were the things that really coalesced the development community around extreme poverty, where there was one goal around environmental sustainability, and then you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which started in 2015, and you see everything that's going to be in this course, basically all the different areas that we're focused on. And I think why that's interesting is, it showed that there's been an increase in interest in the policy area, but you're also now seeing academics coming into these areas for different parts of economics and focusing upon them, often in many of the papers for the first time. So there's not like a whole bunch of papers about marine conservation, for example, in economics, but there's a few, and people are coming in. And I guess one thing that Kelsey and I wanted to do is sort of reach out to you guys and say, please come and work in these areas because they're really important and they're really urgent. This is sort of showing the global picture for where emissions come from. So we've kind of looked at where the damages are, but now we're looking at sort of where the emissions come from. And obviously energy, which is something we've been focused on, is looms large, and that's in buildings, transport, and energy use. But there's also in industry, there's also a whole bunch of stuff in land use, agriculture, forestry, there's waste stuff. And this picture, this circle will look vastly different depending on which country you're in. So, for example, in some countries like Indonesia, that green bit will be a much bigger part of the CERN bit. So I wanted to kind of just now, in the remaining 10 minutes or something that I have, is to think a little about these three areas of innovation. And these are by no means sort of a kind of representative coverage of the topics within the course. But I think it's interesting when I was looking at this, how these three areas, for me anyway, in my own research, but more broadly, have really come up. Like they were kind of nowhere to some degree 5 years ago, and now there's a whole bunch of people working on them. So the first area, and I guess I should say that this is really like work in progress. And my neighbor over here, Oriana Bandiera, is the next door office is cranking data as we speak, trying to figure out whether this graduation program actually improves resilience to shocks, because that's a big question of whether you could sell some programs. So one thing to sort of say about this is I think what will happen over time is many of the things we focused upon within development, like transfer programs, like health programs, will be linked to climate and will no longer be sort of seen as just health programs or just transfer programs. There'll be programs that do both poverty reduction and improve climate resilience, if we can find the evidence to show that. So this is a bunch of research, and I think what's interesting about this research is it really came not from us. It came from this organization called BRAC, which is, I think, one of the biggest NGOs in the world. And I just spent 2 weeks in the field in Bangladesh working with BRAC, actually with my 18-year-old daughter, which is interesting. And what sort of came out of that is that they're now, as an organization, focused very centrally on how they can take programs like this one and adapt them to climate change. So their number one priority is climate change, as are many organizations. But what we're missing, and I guess that's what we're calling for, is we don't have concrete things. Even if we had a bunch of money, which we could shovel into Bangladesh, we don't have a lot of evidence based on how you would improve climate resilience through different programs. And that's kind of what we're working on now. So where I wanted to point with this is, firstly, that we're going to see more of this. So we have Esther Duflo from MIT actually going to hold a lecture on climate adaptation. We have another one on climate migration by Garrett Bryan here and Nalini Morton at Stanford. Another one on inequality of environmental damages by Tamara Carlton and Reed Walker. And then another one on the economic impact of climate change by Michael Greenstone, and on sea level rise. So these are all areas which are not entirely, but largely connected to the adaptation challenges. So you can see that just from this set of lecture topics, that there is all these different dimensions of how you adapt. You use trade, you use many other, so we'll be seeing lots more of this. So what I wanted to do today is to be much more focused on what we've been doing. And so what we've been doing is basically thinking about the inequality to begin with. So this is from a paper with Michael Greenstone showing that the impact between, I think it's 57 and 2017, of the same temperature variation is completely different in the US and India. And when you take that red line, so this is the effect on mortality of an additional day in any of the temperature bins. But the interesting point I want to make, if you take that red line, what you basically see is that's all rural. Okay, so that's basically being driven by the rural population. And then you think, well, clearly we haven't been able to ensure the people of India from excess mortality due to high temperatures. And what's happening is the temperatures are getting even hotter, right? So there's this sort of combination of people in particular types of jobs, often subsistence type jobs, and this worsening environmental situation in terms of more heat, unpredictable rain, and so forth. So in that situation, what we've been thinking of with Oriana and others is, can we get people sort of out of that trap? And this is a graph from a fairly recent paper, where you can see basically that if you get above, when you cross the 45-degree line, if you can push people through this graduation program above that, then they grow out of poverty. But if they're left beneath it, they fall back. And so in simple terms, what we get from this is that you need to have enough of a push of a transfer to move people above that crossing point. And this is going to give us this idea that often if we find a strong correlation, as we do, between the types of jobs that people do, which are very itinerant, very unproductive, very exposed to weather, for example, if you're in subsistence agriculture, then you have to kind of think much more than just providing a small amount of money that moves consumption up. You have to think of a big push that will move you into different types of occupations, in this case, often livestock, which has a more stable return and is less affected by these environmental shocks that are going on all the time. So the key thing we saw in Bangladesh in this recent visit is that the kind of main type of job that these very poor women relied upon, which is agricultural labor, is becoming more difficult because of factors like salinity, the fact that it's getting hotter. And so even that very, very poor return, unproductive job is becoming less available. And so you need to then think, well, what can they move into? It may not be livestock, it may have to be moving to the city, it may have to be moving into different types of more urban occupations. And I think what this tells us is we need a whole bunch of thinking about how does one actually protect people from these changes, particularly in these situations in these countries where they're in a very vulnerable position. And this is important, is what we're comparing here is basically the women above and below the crossing line at the 45-degree line and what happens to their productive assets and consumption. So that's consumption, this is productive assets. And basically what you see is over time, because we've been following them since 2007, the gap increases. So they become more and more protected, have more productive assets, they have more consumption. They kind of, they're basically kind of moving out of harm's way. Partly because they now have diversified income streams, but the actual jobs they're doing are often higher return and more productive. So the bit that we're now focusing on is when we're overlaying shock data and we're seeing when they move out, when they get the program or they're above that crossing line, are they more resilient to these shocks? So imagine a set of women who are above the crossing line and those who are out of the trap and some who are in the trap, and you have a flood in the same village. Is that group then more able to withstand that flood? So that's one set of issues. And I think, important. Another one, which I've been obsessed with, is natural capital. And this comes out of a long collaboration with many people, the main one being with Ben Olkin at MIT, where we've been basically, through a very, very painful process, to be honest, putting together satellite data to kind of monitor forest loss and other processes. Initially with a huge amount of failure in terms of we basically couldn't do it, so we had to turn to people who could, and then we've written a bunch of papers on that. So I think here, one thing that's interesting, which I'll mention very briefly, is that people have become interested in how does one value forests or any kind of natural capital. So you could have, you could have a bit of grassland, you could have ocean, because the interesting thing is when you think about climate change, the initial thinking was, of course, we're going to cut down the forest to get the timber and then move it to some more productive use. That would be how we thought about the problem. But now people say, well, wait a minute, if you cut down the forest, then all that carbon will be released. And so one question becomes, how does one value conserving that piece of land as opposed to exploiting it? And interestingly, the benefits of conserving it don't just accrue to the people within that political jurisdiction where that forest or that reef or whatever is located. So that then comes to a whole set of issues around finance, climate finance, all the sort of ecosystem services, that payments for ecosystem services that Kelsey we talked about. And I think it's really, really interesting. So during Environment Week, we had one of the main advisors to the Zambian president. She was saying, if we could find a way of valuing this stuff and people will pay us for conserving it, we'd be really interested. But we can't just sit there and say we're going to kind of forego the development opportunity from a piece of land just because people in Sweden or the US would prefer us to do that. So I think that's what was quite a powerful moment of thinking, hang on, she's absolutely right. There's no way that they should do that. They would not do that in the absence of climate change. So it kind of changes the whole picture. Similarly, if you have very big shocks of the type, for example, that is experienced by Pakistan, there is a very strong argument that money has to come from elsewhere to compensate those people for the damages they're partly suffering due to emissions that have been historically accreted over time. So here we have a couple of lectures. One right on this by Seema Shah-Jandran at Princeton and Bart Harstad at move this. So Seema and Ben Olkin at MIT, and then another one by Bart Harstad at Stanford. And the one by Bart is really going to get into this kind of international coordination. So let me now just sort of mention a couple of ideas in this area. So the first one is that this is just to show you some satellite data from an old paper of forest loss in Indonesia. And I think the reason I want to do this is that this kind of data is available at a very, very high level of granularity, and it's not just on forests, and pretty much any land use change around the world you can monitor from satellites. And so what's changed is that now we have data, we can begin to apply econometrics and policy evaluation tools to think about whether particular policies to conserve, for example, these things are actually working. And I think that the data revolution, particularly driven by satellites, but by many other forces, have been kind of critical for opening up work in the energy and environment area. So let me just go to one very concrete idea, which doesn't come from me, it comes from Alan Xiao in Princeton. And this was kind of astounding when I first saw it. So these are the emissions, CO2 emissions for different countries, and then one industry, which is the palm industry. And much of the conversion of forests you saw in the Indonesian graph are coming from people converting forests into, well, chopping it down, burning the brush, and then converting it to palm oil. But what's amazing about this is, look, if you look at that carefully, palm's like above the EU, right? So this one industry, which is primarily in Indonesia, Malaysia, is above the EU in terms of emissions. And the numbers for Indonesia are something like 80% of that cutting is illegal. So you're in a world where, which is something that Kelsey and Michael Research have sort of focused upon a lot. You're in a world where that equilibrium, where there's very few beneficiaries. So obviously the people who are growing the palm oil are benefiting. Those benefits, those private benefits, are really, really small compared to the social costs. That's obviously super apparent with forest fires that get out of hand. But it's also true that a lot of this emissions is coming from peat. And so the kind of idea here, which Alan sort of focuses upon, is to say, well, if we go back here one slide, so this is from a paper with Ben Olkin and Claire Balboni, who's now here. The little squares are where the ignitions are, and the orange is the forest that's been cut in the year before. And you can see basically you cut the forest, then you burn it, okay? Now this is a really interesting thing, and this is just an idea at the moment. So if you look at the emissions, so remember these are like higher than the EU, okay? So it's massive amounts of emissions. If you look at these, then most of those emissions are not coming from the trees. They're coming from the peat deposits, so from the soil beneath the trees. And the reason for that is you cut down the trees, and then in order to grow your in order to grow your palm, you have to burn off that peat. So imagine like 30 feet, 50 feet of peat deposits that have to be burnt off. And that's when you get these massive, massive emissions. Now, the idea here is that if you think about space, so you've got forest, some is peat, some is not, some has like big trees and lots of canopy density. It seems to us like with the recent measurement breakthroughs, you could begin to get a bit smarter on where you want to focus your conservation efforts. Because clearly here what you'd want to do is you want to really make sure that you don't grow palm in peat areas if you can possibly avoid it. Because the value of doing that is so much higher than if you were in a non-peat area. And I think what's happening is that there's different, there's different valuation. For example, if you have antelopes running around or rhinos, that biodiversity is super valuable, and you want to avoid exploiting those areas. So I think with better measurement, we're getting into kind of thinking about how do we measure the value of conservation and then compare that to the value of exploitation and find some means, possibly with some international payments, sort of move the equilibrium away from doing things which offer very low returns, low private returns, but produce very huge social costs. Okay, so the final thing, and then I will stop, is sort of the bedrock of what people call the sort of green transition, which is energy. And of course, that goes back to my red circle, my 75% red circle. And I want to focus a little bit here for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think the first is that compared to the problem of poverty reduction was much more seen as a sort of national issue. You have some people, they're poor, built a toolkit on how to kind of confront that. Some of that was macro, some of it was micro. It went all the way from RCTs to trade, right? So, but it was seen basically, this was a group, you wanted to reach them, you wanted to make them less poor. It seems to me that the effect of the kind of climate crisis is to make everything much more international. So if you think about, for example, energy, the innovations in energy are not all going to take place in the countries where that energy is needed. And so what I'm going to do here in these last couple of slides is to try to convince you that that it's actually looking pretty hopeful in terms of the speed at which there's been innovation in renewable energy. The problem is that the diffusion of that renewable energy is not occurring anywhere near the speed at which it's being those innovations are taking place. So I think from a development perspective, a lot of the challenges are going to be about diffusion of that energy. And why that's so important is that whatever country you are in the world, the kind of plan, roughly put, is to have everything be run off electricity. So you're going to have heating run off electricity, you have cooling run off electricity, you have transport run off electricity, you have electricity generation, and industry run off electricity. So for that to happen, you have to have way more electricity, and that electricity has to be clean. And that's not just for the reasons of climate change, it's also for the reasons of air pollution, which is something which we've been looking at here in Environment Week. So in terms of, I'll mention a couple of papers and then finish in the next couple of minutes. And the papers are a bunch of papers, some papers in India with Nick Ryan, Anand Sudarsh, and Michael Gleason, and then principally this paper that is sort of in process looking at what drove innovation in solar in China. And finally, a diffusion paper, probably the best diffusion paper I could find in Chile, of how building transmission lines affected the diffusion energy. Now, very excitingly, we have on our roster a renewables lecture by Mara Guant herself and John Van Reen, who's working with me on the solar thing, and then also, importantly, a lecture on regulation and pollution by Rohini Pandey EL and Nicholas Ryan, who are two of the big players in thinking about environmental regulation. So let me just, in the last couple of minutes, just sort of show you a couple of things. So the first thing is, this is sort of how it all started for me. So we're in rural Bihar, we're doing an evaluation of off-grid solar versus the grid. And these are graphs for a very remote part of rural Bihar between 2013 and 2017. And what you see in the first one is that 73% of households have no electricity. So they're relying on biomass, candles and kerosene or something. And the black thing is actually coming from diesel generation. So literally like burning and having a diesel generator, which you attach to some houses. 4 years later, so by 2017, you've moved down to 36. So, a halving of the people without electricity. And interestingly, a lot of that is the brown. So that's coming off the grid, because the government of India is pumping out the grid and subsidizing it. But the orange and the yellow is solar. And this is just coming from people buying solar panels, the orange bit, the bigger bit. So this is happening across the world, that off-grid, private off-grid is happening. But I think when you begin to think about how development has happened in many countries, clearly from an industrialization perspective, that's not going to work. And so much of the challenge is actually going to be to make sure that, and in this period it's not, that brown stuff is being driven by renewables. So that's really, really the big challenge, is how to create lots and lots of renewable energy and put it into the grid. And on that, I'm not going to say a huge amount, but I am just going to show you a couple of things on China. So why is China interesting? Well, one reason it's interesting is if we look at the period, so this is the fall in the price of solar, China is sort of coming in here. So 2000, there's really no solar industry in China, and they're coming in. And what they're doing is they're putting a huge amount of, so this is the change both in Chile, which we'll come to, and in China, there's this massive change between 2011, so in a 10-year period. And what we've been studying with John and others is basically how that happened. So this is just showing the solar production, and you can see that starting from a very low base, basically China's driving the whole thing, or the bulk of it. And what that is, what's even more interesting, if you look at patents, then these are relative to some of the big patenting countries in solar, that again China has just sort of pushed well ahead on that front. And so what I'm going to do is now show you just through a series of maps what happened to patents in different city regions of China. So this is starting in 2000, this is 2001, so not a whole lot, 2002, 2003, 2005, 2006. I love maps, as you can tell. In 2007, you begin to have the first subsidies coming in different Chinese cities. So this is a paper, kind of diff and diff paper, where we're comparing cities that provided subsidies for the solar industry. And these are the first three in 2007. And as you move forward, and remembering now in the world, production is shooting up, patents are shooting up, you see more and more cities doing this, and just massive amounts of patents. So this is not production, it's actual innovation in the solar industry. And what's interesting here is that if we then, so in terms of the types of subsidies, there's production subsidies, innovation subsidies, and demand subsidies. The first two, the production subsidies are just encouraging production, so standard industrial policy. The innovation subsidies are even more interesting because they're actually encouraging R&D. And when we look at the results, this is basically looking at the difference between cities that got subsidies and those that didn't. Then if we go across a whole range of measures, we're starting to see this big increase, not just in patents, but also in things like, sorry, I've got to be moving all your heads so I can see what my, this is revenue, sorry. Okay, so the most important ones are patents. So clearly more patenting in cities with subsidies. And then when you look at where that came from, it's predominantly coming from the production subsidies and innovation subsidies, because those are the ones that are actually encouraging the industry to develop in that geography. The demand subsidies are things like feed-in tariffs, and those panels that provide that extra solar electricity don't necessarily come from that city region. And then importantly for the graphs I showed to you before, there's this big increase in revenue, but this is a really important one. So now you have exports, many, many, many solar panels leaving China. And what I want to kind of finish with is this wonderful new paper by Mar and others, Koichiro Ito, which basically says, so this is this very skinny country, Chile, and you can see that this blue thing up here is where there's kind of ideals. It's a desert, the Atacama Desert, for solar parks. And these are the dark, the red is sort of the most expensive energy prices. So you have really low energy prices in the solar region, really high energy prices in the southern region, which is where the entire population is. So to finish, I just want to show you what happens when you build a transmission line from the desert down to the population center in Santiago. So you're now moving vast amounts of solar electricity down that transmission line. And the really interesting thing here from an economics perspective is that that's competing with fossil energy and driving down prices. And that there's now papers showing that the pollution was decreased, health was improved. So I will stop there and pass to Kelsey, but thank you very much for listening to me. And I look forward to you all joining the rest of the course. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Robin. So thanks to the enthusiastic participation so far. It's great to see a few of your faces on the screen and to see so many of you joining otherwise. So I'm going to sort of carry on from where Robin left us. And one thing that I want to say about kind of the approach that we've taken for today is that we wanted to offer kind of a rather than giving you a broad overview and a framework and some theories to be thinking about and so on, rather use this lecture to give you a sense of why we, Robin and I, are so personally excited about this area of work and try to get you excited about it as well. In doing so, to tell you a little bit about some of the topics that we work on, but really give you a taste of things that are going to be coming up later in this course. So Robin has already talked about a number of things that will be picked up by lectures that are going to be coming later on. And that's really what I want to do as well for the next 20 minutes or so. One thing to remind you of is each of these lectures is going to last for an hour, followed by about a 20-minute Q&A session. So many of the questions that you're posing and things that the lectures and readings are bringing up, you'll have an opportunity for a little bit more engagement during the Q&A session as well for questions that don't get answered. All right, excellent. So what I wanted to do to start us off is just share with you sort of my motivation for thinking about why is it so important to study environmental topics in low and middle income countries. And to me, a lot of what these photos are bringing up is local environmental quality. So local environmental quality affects people's lives on a daily basis. It shortens life expectancy. It lowers productivity. You're going to hear a lot over the remaining 9 lectures about the growing and already present threat of climate change, but keeping in mind that a lot of these kind of local air quality, for example, problems are co-pollutants with climate damages. And so, these ideas and opportunities for thinking about how do you simultaneously get kind of international support for addressing climate to coincide with the local needs of low-income populations. I think that this is a particularly important opportunity where these two things really come together from the perspective of kind of economic growth, increasing productivity by lowering pollution, by improving air quality, improving life expectancies and livelihoods. These are kind of the opportunities where we might think there's some kind of win-win strategies that could be available. So, that's this first point that, these topics are important. And there's increasingly evidence that both the environment affects economic development through things like income and productivity, but also that the process of economic development affects the environment. And so when we're thinking about development, it's not just a kind of one size fits all path, but that being sort of conscious and thoughtful about what investment happens, how growth looks, can have really important implications for whether, for example, that growth is relatively clean or relatively dirty. There's less work. I think Robin motivated this already, but I know most of you are PhD students, so questions like what research could I do? Well, these are topics where there's just much less work that's been done if you compare it to, for example, environmental economics in the United States and Europe, where there's just a lot more work that's been done. And I'm going to give you a couple examples from my own work where I think increasingly trying to pull in data sets that have not necessarily been kind of the bread and butter of development economics helps open the door to studying some of these topics that have previously been a bit harder to work on. And then crucially important, if we think that policy has a role to play, and it almost certainly does, we know that policy is important for environmental economics because of the externalities and public goods involved. We can't necessarily expect that individuals are going to voluntarily do things that have positive environmental externalities if there's some private cost of doing that. So, regulation is necessary. We need the evidence. We need to understand some of these trade-offs between, for example, these positive externalities and individual livelihoods to try to figure out what are the right policies really to pursue. So this is a case where, research for research's sake is not necessarily what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about research that has potential to actually impact policy and be relevant on the ground. All right, excellent. So, I like to think about this kind of broad question of, well, is there something different here when we start to think about environmental economics in low and middle income country settings? Is this any different from the work that's been done to study environmental issues in the US and Europe? And I think the answer, at least to me, is sometimes. Sometimes it's different, sometimes it's actually the same. So in some cases, it may just be that the magnitudes are different, that we're talking about different levels of income, we're talking about different levels of pollution, for example. And so it's not so much that we have to really fundamentally frame questions differently. It's more that costs and benefits might just look very, very different. But in other cases, maybe it's different topics that are important to understand. And maybe there are important institutional state capacity, contextual, population-based types of things that mean that actually, no, it does start to look quite different. And I'll give you one example of a case where I think that's a bit true. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of pick up a bit on the approach that Robin took and largely talk about myself, which is something that academics, as you know, love to do, and tell you a little bit about two projects that I think kind of exemplify some of the approach that we think this course is taking, but also touches on some themes that you're going to keep seeing and get more into depth in future lectures. The first is related to climate adaptation and inequality, and the second is trying to think about the importance of adapting policy design to local context. There's not a ton of time remaining, so I'm going to go through these very, very quickly, and so hopefully it'll be enough to kind of whet your appetite. So on the first one, this is sort of ongoing work with several collaborators, including Martijn Visser from the University of Cape Town. In this project, we're thinking about municipal water scarcity. So the fact that, increasingly climate change is placing pressure on urban populations, and the threat of water scarcity is growing. There are projections, for example, that 1 billion people are going to be facing municipal water scarcity in the not so distant future. This is coming from a variety of different sources. This is both because of rapid urbanization in many contexts, increasing demand, but at the same time, climate change is lowering supply in some cases, or in other cases, just making it less predictable, more erratic, for example. When we think about climate adaptation, typically we think about, actually, let me go back to this for just a second. Typically, we think about individual actions that people are potentially taking to protect themselves from the threats of climate change. In these urban settings, it may not be the individual who is taking the action, but it may be, for example, the water utility that's trying to adapt to these fluctuations in supply. And what we are investigating in this paper is the effect that can have on inequality in a setting, which is Cape Town, South Africa, that is already very, very unequal. So this is a project where we're studying kind of the poster child of urban water scarcity in recent years, which is this event that happened leading up to sort of culminating in 2018 in this countdown to what was being labeled as day zero, the day when the municipal water utility would actually cease to be viable, that dam levels would sink to a point that the municipal water supply would just shut off. And so the thing that's very striking about that is that, for those of you who are following this water crisis, the city did manage to avoid day zero. So it's a bit of a spoiler to what we find in the research, but the city did manage to avoid day zero. But what we are trying to unpack here is how and what are the implications of that. So if you look, this is an example actually of starting to think about what kinds of data sources could people interested in environmental topics in low and middle income settings be using. This is using administrative data collected by the city of Cape Town. These are billing records at the household level for municipal water use. And what you can see from this is plotting municipal water use by decile of the property value distribution. This is a fairly good proxy for household wealth. What you can see is that in these early years in our data set, the richest households, those that are the lightest color on this graph, are using much more water than their poorer neighbors, and their water use is very, very seasonal. So during the dry season, during the summer months, people are watering their lawns or doing other things like that. Now, you can start to see this pattern start to collapse when this drought really sets in. And then leading up to, I mentioned this culminated in 2018, what you see here is this just rapid decline in municipal water use. This is what allowed the city to not shut off their urban water supply. But more importantly, what you see is this reversal in the ranking of water use across these wealth deciles. And so at the peak of this water crisis, at the very far right of what I'm showing on the screen, you can see that the lightest colors, the richest households, are actually using less municipal water than the lower property value households. Now, if we follow this out a little bit, the other thing that's quite remarkable here is following this crisis, water tariffs, which I haven't told you about, but water tariffs kind of go back to normal. But this pattern of both a compression in how much water different people are using and this persistently lower level of water use really persists over time. So one puzzle that comes up with this is, well, what happened here? Is it just that the wealthiest households were the best able to adapt to the situation? I don't have time to get into it here, but tariffs went up quite dramatically during this time. So people are responding to changes in tariffs, et cetera. What we're trying to unpack here is that there's another potential opportunity for water use, which is to tap into the groundwater. And so this is showing you licenses for groundwater applications, again, split by property value deciles. And what you see here is that there was a lot of groundwater access. We're certainly not arguing that this is all of the reduction in water use, but a lot of groundwater access by these richest households. Now, fast forwarding a little bit, if you also look at groundwater depths, you can actually see this in kind of the immediate groundwater monitoring wells around richer versus poorer neighborhoods. You actually see a decline in groundwater levels in the places where it looks like people were starting to really tap into the aquifer. So this really highlights two things, and this is the reason I'm showing it to you is to get you sort of thinking about two things here. One is the inequality that climate adaptation can potentially introduce. So this is a case where the richer households had the capital available, the resources available to invest in sinking a well. For them, the credit constraints, the upfront costs, et cetera, but also the fact that they have so much higher water demand means that it's worth it for them to go ahead and make this investment, whereas for lower income households, potentially not necessarily. The other thing, though, is that this exerts this big kind of fiscal externality on the poorer households because the municipal government still has to supply water. They still have to cover the costs of operating a water system in Cape Town. And so now the higher income households used to kind of cross-subsidize a lot of these infrastructure costs for the lower income household, but now everybody's using very little water. And so that transfers some of this kind of fiscal burden of maintaining the water supply onto these lower income households. Now, there were some important policy responses that helped to protect the lower income households. We're going to be putting all of that into the paper. But I think the point here is that in this case, the adoption of substitutes, the ability to adapt without really affecting your livelihood all that much, that was something that the rich households could afford to do, whereas the lower income households had to just pay these higher tariffs and reduce their water use. And this has kind of durable consequences even after this climate shock passes. So this is teeing up some of what you're going to see in the lecture on the inequality of environmental damages. It's teeing up some of what you're going to see in the lecture on climate adaptation. And it's just an example of some of the styles of research that you may be able to see in this course and the use of data and a case study to illustrate some potentially broader themes. We're quite short on time, so let me just give you like a very, very kind of brief overview of one other case study that I wanted to tell you a little bit about. This is much more thinking about solutions. So I think Robin started to talk a little bit more about solutions in thinking about innovation. This is a different style of research. This is actually trying to test out whether different types of solutions are going to actually have impacts, to try to understand what are the kind of costs and benefits to regulated individuals, to individuals who are subject to a policy. This is studying, I think, one of the most classic environmental externality types of situations that I've encountered, which is farmers in India who are planting rice paddy and a winter crop, have a very short window of time to clear their fields to prepare them for planting a second crop. The cheapest and most available technology for clearing the fields is a very ancient technology, which is fire. Turns out if you set the rice stubble that's left behind after you harvest, if you set it on fire, that's a very, very effective way to clear the land. But unfortunately, it's a way that has tremendous externalities associated with it. So the smoke that's being released has a lot of toxins in it. The prevailing wind patterns at this time of year blow this smoke over Delhi, which is a huge population center, as you all know. And so it's kind of this very textbook environmental externality story where the costs are largely external to the farmer. The benefits of a quick and effective way to clear the land are what the individual is typically responding to. So this is a collaboration, I should say, with the folks listed at the top of the slide, and there is a working paper available for this one. This is a topic that the Indian government has tried to address for quite a long time. There are bans, there are subsidies for different alternatives to burning. For the most part, these approaches really haven't been terribly effective. And so what we wanted to do in this project is evaluate an alternative, which is a payments for ecosystem services type of an approach, basically trying to subsidize, realizing that from the farmer's perspective, it is costly to do something other than burn. And so can we make them whole again? Can we compensate them for those costs? And at the same time, create incentives to do something that has more positive, that reduces this negative environmental externality. We did this using a randomized controlled trial. And the thing that I really want to highlight out of this is that we thought very carefully about what are some of the barriers to policy effectiveness in this particular context, and can we take those contextual features and think about them in innovating on kind of standard policy design to try to address some of the potential barriers in this particular setting. And so here the concern was that a standard payments for ecosystem services contract, the way that it works is that individuals are offered some kind of a conditional payment if they do kind of the right thing, if they do the environmentally friendly thing. The problem with that, of course, is that you're asking a farmer in this case to hire some other equipment to do something much more costly than burning today in the promise of some payment tomorrow. And if that farmer just doesn't have the cash on hand to be able to do that, or if he or she doesn't trust that that payment is actually going to be made, that may mean that no behavior change actually happens. That may undermine this kind of contract design. So what we did is we tested, does it help if you give some of the payment up front? Not all of it. You still want to create an incentive by having some payment conditional on not burning. But at the same time, we wanted to see if this addresses the trust barrier and also gives farmers access to some cash on hand at the time that they need it. So we did this using a randomized controlled trial. So again, another kind of example of a case study, another example of as well of using some innovative data. So here, to be able to see what happened in the control group, we needed satellite data. So like Robin's story of the long and tortuous path to processing the forest data, we did the same thing with the crop residue burning, trying to find evidence of burn scars. And what you can see on the left is the treatment effects, the standard contract where we're just paying people conditional on observing that they didn't burn. And then this upfront, this kind of new type of contract that tries to address some of the potential barriers in this setting. And you can see that there's about a 10 percentage point improvement in the likelihood that a farmer actually didn't burn his or her field in response to this upfront transfer. This is contract compliance. What you see on the right is the data from the satellite, highlighting again the importance of kind of new and innovative types of data, because what you see there is that we see the same treatment effect going from this kind of regular contract to this kind of new adapted contract. But what we would miss if we just looked at the compliance data is the fact that all of the farmers who didn't burn under the conditional payment wouldn't have burned anyway. So those are all kind of inframarginal payments. Yet this upfront contract still is very cost effective. Okay, so that's a little bit in the weeds. The point here is that these are massive environmental externalities. It's very, very cost effective in this case to actually reduce these through these kinds of payment contracts, but these payment contracts have to be adapted to the local context. And so you're going to see a whole lecture on environmental regulation, and I think you'll see this theme coming up again and again, that we need to be thinking carefully about what are the regulations that are going to work, what are the regulations that are going to balance environmental concerns with livelihood concerns, what are the regulatory approaches that are going to address concerns about, for example, state capacity, other types of situations that we may be facing in these cases. Okay, so we are close to out of time. Let's see, here's the last slide that I have, and let me just wrap up with a few additional words about how this course is going to work. So, first of all, thank you for attending this kickoff lecture. It's very different from the other lectures that you should expect to see, which are going to delve much more deeply into a particular topic, that are going to give you a lot more of kind of what is, the state of the literature, what are some of the pressing open questions. I think one thing that you should all be very excited about is by the end of this 10-week series that you should have a lot of new research ideas coming out of it. I think that most of these lectures are going to raise more unanswered questions than they are going to answer questions. And so again, if you're a PhD student, that is exactly what you want. This is the agenda that you have in front of you over the remaining 9 lectures. And just to say, we could have organized this around kind of classic models, around other things like that. What we thought was more important is to give you all a sense of topic areas where research is really needed, and to allow you to see kind of these deeper dives into particular ways that researchers are trying to grapple with these really pressing issues and trying to make progress on them. I think that's what you have to look forward to. Each lecture, as I mentioned, is going to be followed by this Q&A session where either the lecturers or a PhD student will be able to stick around and really get into some of the topics and address some of the questions. Because the lecture time periods are quite short, typically we're not going to have a lot of time to answer the great questions that are coming up as we go. All of the lectures will be posted. I know there have been some questions about that, so all of the lectures will be posted and accessible. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Robin, do you have any remaining words? And otherwise, I don't know if Caleb, you want to say anything else from a kind of administrative standpoint.
I just wanted to say sort of 3 things. I guess the first thing is thank you very much for listening to us. And it's kind of amazing to see, where you're all from across the whole world. So the way I think about this is basically kind of a movement of people who are interested in this set of topics. So I think the main thing I wanted to kind of impart to you is that please persevere with the remainder of the lectures, because you're going to learn a huge amount. We've assembled a really amazing set of lecturers to talk about different topics. So I would try to attend as many of the lectures you can, ideally all of them, because I think you'll learn a lot. It'll kind of be an inspiration for you to work more in this area. So that was the sort of main thing. And the second thing, kind of building on what Kelsey said, is the way we've done this is we've kind of done it by topic, so you can begin to sort of see how people are approaching a topic. When I first came into environmental economics, it was all a little bit dry and second best theory and whatever. I think what really inspires people is the ability to approach a topic and actually do some research, which might actually inform policy. And I think we're in that sort of situation where we actually have to do that, because these issues are so pressing. So I think the main thing is please stay with us and with the other lecturers. And I'm very happy to stay on for a couple of minutes if that's useful. Thank you. But mainly thank you for staying with us for the hour.
Thank you, Robin and Kelsey. The only thing that I'll add is that all these lectures will be available in the link that's in the chat, and that the reading list for next week is already posted. So please access that to prepare, and really, really thank you for coming. With that, I will kind of give the time over to Allegra, Kelsey, Robin for the Q&A.
Excellent. Great. So how I think we can start this off is, Robin, I will take a few questions from folks who have raised their hands, and we can answer for sake of time, because we have about 20 minutes. I just ask everyone keeps their question concise, and we'll do the best to answer. So the first person I'm going to take is Jivan, if you'd like to ask your question. Can you hear them? Jivan, maybe I can't hear you, so I'm going to move to the next person. This is Tyrene.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Tafrin from Bangladesh. So I have a query regarding the experimental design done in Punjab. I also posted in the Q&A question answer session. So how did you actually calculate the amount for payment while providing it to the farmers? Was it equal to the amount of doing the right approach of not burning the field? I mean, if the farmers decided that they would not burn the bill and they have to incur the cost of cleaning the field by doing the right approach, so they had to incur a specific amount of cost. So my question is, was the amount that you provided to the farmers equal to the cost that the farmer needed to clean the field by doing the right approach? And my another question is that you know that there are lots of farmers who can be like poor, marginal, rich farmers. So how did you take any kind of initiative, or did you provide any kinds of incentives to motivate different intensive to motivate the marginal or poor farmers that is pretty much different to motivate the rich farmers? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Those are excellent questions. The first question on the payment amount. So the way that that we thought about this was, first of all, we wanted to test a level of payment that we thought, if it worked, could help inform policy. So we had a series of conversations with the state government in Punjab about what would be kind of a level of payment that they thought might be something they could take forward. And so that was actually really our starting point. It was a bit less trying to calculate how much we thought exactly a farmer would need. I went through the design very quickly, but you can read a bit more if you're interested in the working paper later. But one thing that we did is we actually had an experimental arm where we tested a higher payment level to try to understand how that would affect both participation and compliance. But our starting point was really to try to figure out what would be something that would be viable to scale up, because certainly if you pay people enough, you can probably change a lot of behavior. The idea as well is that there's some heterogeneity in people's kind of opportunity cost of not burning, how much they really need to be compensated. And what we found from the satellite data, at least, is that it looks like in our particular sample, which was actually a sample that was selected to have a high likelihood of burning, which was, you know, useful for an experimental design and statistical power, that that in that sample it looked like about 10 to 20% of the control group were not burning their fields. And so for those farmers, at least the cost is zero to not burn. And so the idea being that there's some heterogeneity, and so at any payment level, it may be sufficient to induce some farmers to change their behavior, but maybe not all farmers. But kind of the cost-effective level may not, in fact, be the one that gets every single farmer to change their practices. in terms of this question about kind of whose behavior actually changes, I think that's a really interesting question for future work. In our case, what we were most interested in is just kind of measuring an average treatment effect of, can you actually get any kind of behavior change on this particular environmental problem, which has been quite difficult to get any movement on in the past. But I think going forward, trying to understand who has access, et cetera. And the upfront payment arm that I mentioned was in many ways like explicitly designed to make it more accessible to lower income farmers to have the cash or the capital that they would need at the time of the year that they need to pay for some kind of an alternative. But thanks for the great question.
Thank you.
Great. So next we're going to take Nitesh.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the amazing session. Now, my question is very briefly to the point that there is growing literature in environment, and especially when it comes to the intersection between environment and economics, that the idea of continuous growth somewhere in terms of material growth, which will rely heavily on newer sources of energy, somewhere is in violation of the laws of nature and laws of thermodynamics in physics, which means that we cannot go in this manner for a long term. So in that sense, I wanted to know the views of the professors in terms of whether or how much substance is there to this claim, and if at all there is some substance to this, then the environmental economics discipline, is it actually going to integrate those things going forward in the long run, or how are we proceeding on that?
Well, do we want to go one question at a time? Okay, so do you want me to take this one, Kelsey? So I guess just three very quick things. The first thing is that politically, it's very difficult for governments to go to their electorate with a we're not going to increase living standards anymore platform. So, part of development is increasing the consumption, not just of energy, but of other natural resources. So the challenge then is, how do you do that without creating huge environmental damages, which is what a lot of what we've been, just touching upon today, but which will be sort of delved into much more deeply. And I think the other thing to notice, which is super interesting, is that there's a kind of arc where at the very bottom in subsistence, a lot of damages, right? You're just being hit by shocks, you have very few resources. And then there's a kind of going through the industrialization, urbanization process. But increasingly, there's evidence that as you become more advanced, move more into services, you move into much more energy efficient manufacturing, actually emissions are dropping. So I think one of the reasons that I'm pointing at innovation is I think it's going to be the way that you kind of take that path, as it were, through from achieving higher living standards whilst not destroying the planet. I'm not saying we're going to get there, but that's kind of why we're doing this, is to encourage you to work in this area so that we do make it. Because I think one thing that's forgotten often is it's not like we can just fix it in one go. The path is still up on emissions and damages. So it's like we have to actually come to a position where there's a balance, which I think is what you're pointing at, between the natural environment and human activity. That's really the big challenge. And that has to come from all sorts of sectors and all types of jobs. So whatever job you're going to do in your lifetime, so you're mainly young, you will confront this issue in a very central way, whether it's private sector, government, or academia.
Great, thank you, Nitesh. So Robin, I'm going to summarize just a few questions in the chat. So there's been a few questions on how we compare the relative emissions coming from developing countries today, such as China and India, and then also the historical emissions of countries that have had electrification and manufacturing for longer years. And people want to know particularly what climate finance mechanisms or environmental, what economists can do in order to use climate finance mechanisms to work on this issue, or to talk about how we think about the trade-off between historical emissions in developed countries and then new emissions in developing countries today.
Okay, that's a big one. Maybe Kelsey.
I actually think Kelsey has had to leave, so we have about 5 minutes left. If you're able to speak to it.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to say something. I mean, I think this is a personal perspective. I think that the moral, ethical argument that we should not do some form of redistribution is, for me anyway, it may not be for everyone, is undeniable. The historical accumulation of greenhouse gases and other, are mainly from the currently industrialized nations. Now, of course, the path of where emissions will go are increasingly in the lower and middle income countries. And so you can't sort of say, well, we're not going to do mitigation in lower middle income countries because, as I said, it'll just keep going up and then the whole planet will. So there's a huge, but I think three things. So one thing which is super interesting, I'm about to run off to a session which involves Arkibi Okubai, who's the main sort of advisor on industrial policy in Ethiopia, Ed Miliband, who's the shadow environment minister, and Heather Boucher, who's the main architect of the Inflation Reduction Act. The fact that these three people are meeting in London to talk about green industrial policy is sort of pointing to something which I think there is a much greater willingness to discuss international collaboration. And part of that international collaboration would be, for example, to transfer money into countries to create and diffuse clean energy, but also, very importantly, for example, to pay for climate adaptation and social protection, and even to pay for the protection of natural capital, because obviously if the Amazon, the forest in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Indonesia all disappear, that's going to be a disaster for all of us. So I think there's a kind of, this issue is so much more international than development was, because development happened over there, whereas what happens over there now comes back to affect what happens over here and vice versa. So I guess what I'm pushing at is that it's really not a developing country issue, it's a global issue. And we're going to require a lot of international collaboration confronted. But from my own personal perspective, I think it's just undeniable that some of that will have to involve climate finance moving from the industrialized nations and the industrialized nations taxpayers into lower and middle income countries. And how we design that is still being thought out. But I think that's a huge and important area of research, which Bart Harstad will be focused on, because you can use finance, you can use trade barriers, there's many different ways of getting into that.
Okay, great. We'll take another question from the panelists. Pedro, if you could speak and keep it concise.
Okay, thank you guys. I'm Pedro from Brazil. Just to take right in the issue of the burning of the rice. We have a lot of experience with that, but in the sugarcane sector, we used to burn the sugarcane for increase the harvesting productivity, and we could phase out this burning with a green protocol that it was settled by the producers and the government, but I mean it was not imposed by government. And in this green protocol calendar, the farmers could easily and with the first years do that by voluntarily, and after 5 years they were obligated to phase out. They were obligated to stop burning. So my question would be a little bit to discuss between in the economic instruments against command and control instruments. Once that burning, in the case of Brazil, they used to generate a lot of environmental impacts, so they were abolished, they were prohibited. So why not in the case of India to put legislations to interrupt? Not why the decision is to put the economic instrument to pay them not to burn, instead of okay, we have some time to change this culture of burning to the culture of non-burning. And after these 40 years, the burning will be abolished, will be prohibited.
I mean, very quickly on that, that's the kind of general principle where I believe, I think it's called the happy seeder. So there's some technology that will crunch up the rice husks and put it back into the sun. The problem is right now for some farmers, you know, if you can just burn, that's cheaper. So I think what you're pointing to is basically that if you gave them a grace period where they then adopted some other technology, that only works if there's real bite at the end of that grace period, that they will actually impose some penalties. And the problem in India and many parts of South Asia is that the farmers are very powerful politically. And so whether it's credible that the government of Punjab would actually clamp down on the farmers that continue to burn, I don't think is at this point in history completely credible. It's very much like what many countries are doing with cars. They're saying, you know, by whatever 2040, you can't have any more petrol engines, and you have to all have electric cars or something. I think many people are sort of second guessing whether those governments are actually going to be able to impose those rules, because everybody, you know, doesn't want to get rid of their petrol cars. But if they really believe that they had 10, 20 years, and I think there'd be a very rapid increase in the adoption of electric cars, because a car, you know, maybe some cars will last 20 years. You don't want to buy a car now knowing that in 10 years you'll have to scrap that car. So I completely agree with you. I think the command and control works really, really well when you have real regulatory bite supported by political will, but much less so so all that crop burning is all illegal. All the burning of the forest in Indonesia, all illegal. But, you know, we're in one of the papers, I think we found 108,000 different forest fires in Indonesia over a 20 period, all of them illegal. But the fact of the matter is that group, the oil palm group, is very powerful. So there's basically not much credible penalties. So you need the credible penalties supported by political will to have command and control.
Great, thank you. So at this time, I can take additional questions for the next 3 minutes. Robin, would you like to stay on and continue to field a few more? One question from someone in the Q&A is on, is it possible to create a market for pollution? And I thought maybe we could speak to that.
Yeah, so there's been some recent work in Gujarat, where there was a market for particulate pollution, which has been successful. I think it's a 30% reduction in particulate pollution. I think one big sort of looming question is whether, going back to the previous question, whether some form, and particulate pollution emissions trading is basically a kind of carbon tax. Whether or not, as the situation worsens, to get more pollution, more hot days, and so on, and these hot days are getting really extreme in many countries, whether the political support of carbon taxation will increase. When I was in Bangladesh, which wasn't the hottest period in August, I compared to a year ago, there was already a greater willingness to discuss these things because there's been sort of freaky weather and really hot. So I think the kind of political appetite for carbon taxes is increasing. So that would be another, so I think, it's possible to create such markets. Again, it requires political will and proper implementation of the regulations that need to support those markets. But they're a great way of, for example, the EU emissions trading scheme has proven to be very successful in terms of reducing emissions within Europe. So I think taking these ideas from wherever they emerge, they don't all emerge from developed countries, often emerge in developing countries, and moving them around is a big sort of advantage of having a group like you who come from all over the world.
Great. I think we will call the questions for the end of the day, as it's 20 minutes past the hour. Thank you very much for your participation again, to Robin and Kelsey for lecturing, and for Caleb for organizing. Is there anything else we need to cover before we log off. Again, the materials will be posted online on the IGC website, so you can access the slides, which will contain some of the references. I saw folks asking in the Q&A for the references. They may not have links, but the titles of the paper will be there. And for any other logistical questions, you can reach out to the IGC research email address that has also been posted. The next week's lecture will be at the same time from 4 to 5 p.m. BST.
Who's the next lecture?
It will be next Thursday at the same time, 4 to 5 p.m. BST.
Who's giving it?
Who is giving it? Seema Jayachandra and Benjamin Olkin. So the topic will be economics of conservation.
Brilliant. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining, and keep going. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We leave the webinar.
All right, and for everyone.